The long inner struggle over this decision cost Hume dearly, and shortly afterward he had a nervous breakdown. Hume went back to Ninewells, but his recovery was only intermittent. Between bouts of depression, he continued excitedly pursuing his new ideas. The local physician was called in several times, and was of the opinion that Hume was suffering from the disease of the learned. He prescribed a course of bitters and antihysteric pills. He also advised Hume to take an English pint of claret every day, and regular exercise in the form of long horseback rides. Until now, Hume had been tall and thin, a gawky fellow with gangling limbs. Yet, despite his regimen of exercise, he now began putting on weight. On his daily rides into the bare, hilly countryside, the horse became thinner as its rider expanded, gradually becoming the portly figure he was to remain for the rest of his life. This suggests that Hume's troubles during this period may in part have been glandular. Hume's recovery was only gradual and may in fact never have been complete. Certain mysterious episodes during his later life suggest recurrent mental instability. Hume had no wish to continue living with his mother at Ninewells forever. In 1734, a friend of the family found him a job as a clerk to a shipping merchant in Bristol. His motives for taking this job were various. He certainly needed the money. He also understood that the job would involve foreign travel. This appealed to his sense of adventure, and he also felt it would be beneficial for his mental health. There is strong evidence that this continued to worry him. On his way to Bristol, Hume passed through London. Here he composed a long letter to Dr. Arbuthnot, one of the leading physicians of the day. In it, Hume does his best to describe his illness, though his description is severely hampered by the limited knowledge and inadequate concepts of the day. He describes his disease as this distemper, and refers to his inflamed imaginations. He says, "I was continually fortifying myself with reflections against death and poverty and shame and pain and all the other calamities of life." After outlining the remedies prescribed by his physician, he passes inconsequentially to some philosophical reflections. "I believe 'tis a certain fact that most of the philosophers who have gone before us have been overthrown by the greatness of their genius, and that little more is required to make a man succeed in this study than to throw off all prejudices either for his own opinions or for this of others." Hume ends by asking various questions about his illness, whether I can hope for a recovery, which he answers himself, "Assuredly you can," and this appears to have done the trick. Hume never sent his 10-page letter, though he kept it all his life. He seems to have found that the mere writing of it was a cure in itself, or at least as near a cure as he would ever find. Hume now settled down to work in Bristol, and discovered that his job as a clerk was unlikely to involve any foreign travel. Relations with his employer gradually deteriorated, and eventually he left his job. By his 24th birthday he was back at Ninewells, where he began to get a bad name for his superior and irreligious ways. By this stage, Hume had inherited a small private income of £40 sterling a year, which enabled him to live frugally without having to work. He now set about writing down his philosophical observations with the aim of creating a new philosophy which would make him famous. Throughout his life, Hume made little secret of his ultimate aim, "My love of literary fame, my ruling passion," and it was as a literary figure more than as a philosopher that Hume was to achieve fame. In later life, Boswell was to refer to him as the greatest writer in Britain, and to this day he is listed in the British Library catalogue as David Hume, the historian. After a few months, Hume decided to set off for France. Here he could live well on his small private income, and in isolation he would be able to concentrate on his new philosophy without interruption or speculations of a more practical nature. At Ninewells, there was always Mother and his uncle, neither of whom were philosophy fans. There is a story that Hume left Ninewells in a hurry. Not long after he went to France, an unmarried young local woman called Agnes, who was said to have a bad record with such matters, announced that she was pregnant. The attitude toward this kind of thing in Scotland at the time was all very Christian. Poor, deserted Agnes was exhibited at church, where the parish minister, Hume's uncle, delivered the customary public denouncement, which ended with the pious hope that she would die in childbirth. As if this display of compassion and Christian love were not enough, Agnes was then hauled before the sessions, where she almost certainly received a further punishment, again probably involving some kind of public humiliation, always a favoured method of retribution in a hypocritical society. I'm told that this is due to unconscious masochism, the thrill induced by the fact that you haven't yet been caught. During the course of Agnes's examination at the session, she eventually named the absent Hume as the father of her unborn child, probably to protect the real father. This was the session's firm conviction at any rate. We will never know the truth. With one notable exception, this is the main evidence we have of Hume's sexual inclinations. According to Mosner, Hume, in later life in Italy and France and Scotland, was to prove a man of normal sexual desires. Since not much else is recorded about these sexual desires, one can only assume they were fulfilled by hospitality, with enthusiastic chambermaids and demanding hostesses. And since Hume is one of the few literary figures of the age who didn't catch the pox, it's unlikely that this hospitality was very frequent, or that he went with whores, who at the time were cheaper than hot water bottles. Well, this latter is intended as a purely socio-economic observation, with no sexist undertones. These disease-ridden human hot water bottles would in most cases have arrived at their condition after suffering the same fate as Agnes, victims of the hypocrisy so necessary to any upright society of closet masochists. Hume went first to live in Rheims, but later moved to La Flèche, almost certainly because of its inspiring associations with Descartes, who had been educated there at the Jesuit college. Within 3 years, Hume had finished A Treatise of Human Nature. He was later to disparage this work because of what he considered to be its youthful extravagances, but he did not disavow its philosophy, which contains almost all the original philosophical ideas for which he is today remembered. Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, is even of the view that this work contains the best parts of Hume's philosophy. Some achievement for a man who was not yet 30. In A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume attempted to define the basic principles of human knowledge. How do we know anything for certain? And what exactly is it that we do know for certain? In trying to answer these questions, he followed in the empiricist tradition, believing that all our knowledge is ultimately based on experience. In Hume's view, experience consists of perceptions, of which there are 2 types. Those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we may name impressions, and under this name I comprehend all our sensations, passions, and emotions as they make their first appearance in the soul. By ideas I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. He explains, every simple idea has a simple impression which resembles it. But we can also form complex ideas. These are derived from impressions, by way of simple ideas, but need not necessarily conform to an impression. For example, we can imagine a mermaid by combining our idea of a fish and our idea of a woman. By adhering strictly to this notion of impressions and ideas as the only certain basis for our knowledge, Hume arrives at some astonishing conclusions. Objects, continuity, the self, even cause and effect, all these are shown to be fallacious notions. We never actually experience an object, only impressions of its colour, shape, consistency, taste, and so forth. Likewise, we have no actual impression that corresponds to continuity. Things simply happen one after another. We can't even say that one thing causes another to happen. We may observe one thing constantly following another, lit gunpowder, explosion, but there is no logical connection between the two, and no logical reason why they will happen in sequence in the future. We have no other notion of cause and effect, but that of certain objects which have been always conjoined together. Induction, by a process of simple enumeration, has no logical force. All swans had been white before the discovery in Hume's time of black swans in Australia. Thus, swans had not been necessarily white, any more than a flame necessarily caused gunpowder to explode. There are many difficulties in Hume's approach, and these are not just limited to common sense. How can we possibly carry on living if this is all we know for certain? Hume was well aware of this objection to his philosophy. When we leave our closet and engage in the common affairs of life, its conclusions seem to vanish like the phantoms of the night on the appearance of morning, and it is difficult for us to retain even that conviction which we had attained with difficulty. What in fact Hume was pointing out was the utter precariousness of the human condition with regard to knowledge. We think we know a great deal, but in reality much of what we think we know is mere supposition. Reliable supposition, but supposition nonetheless. This position is strangely similar to the state of knowledge today, when the ultimate truths of science have long since departed the realms of credibility or common sense. We grudgingly accept the truths of science, which would have us believe that a torrent of subatomic particles streams through our during this period may in part have been glandular. Hume's recovery was only gradual and may in fact never have been complete. Certain mysterious episodes during his later life suggest recurrent mental instability. Excitedly pursuing his new ideas. The local physician was called in several times, and was of the opinion that Hume was suffering from the disease of the learned. He prescribed a course of bitters and antihysteric pills. He also exercised. He now began putting on weight. On his daily rides into the bare, hilly countryside, the horse became thinner as its rider expanded, gradually becoming the portly figure he was to remain for the rest of his life. This suggests that Hume's trouble advised Hume to take an English pint of claret every day, and regular exercise in the form of long horseback rides. Until now, Hume had been tall and thin, a gawky fellow with gangling limbs. Yet, despite his regimen of the long inner struggle over this decision cost Hume dearly, and shortly afterward he had a nervous breakdown. Hume went back to Ninewells, but his recovery was only intermittent. Between bouts of depression, he continued